Chapter 2. The Deal. Arthur entered the building to the hotel. He knew the layout all too well. It was the safest place he could find in a short amount of time since arriving in Boston. The hotel wasn't all too grand, but it was nice enough for him to lay low for a few days. He and the merchant had come through the front common area, which Arthur had initially used to escape the company of people. He'd like to, on normal occasions, use backdoor exits or fire escapes to leave. The parlour was dressed like a library, with a few scattered chairs and tables that held dimly lit candles on them. He'd seen the merchant check into his hotel room, but thought nothing of it. It wasn't until his amulet had gone missing that he began to ask questions. It couldn't have been him, Arthur voiced in his head again as he studied him. Mr. Wilson, the merchant, was a short, stoutly man who dressed very formally. However, by what Arthur could perceive from his observation of him at the pub, he was even more unsullied than he was. No, the man was much too tidy to even harbour the thought of breaking into his own room. Arthur watched as Mr. Wilson's eyes darted from door to door, looking for a way out. His eyes finally landed on the old, bony innkeeper, who was busy hunched over a small burning candle, nose in the newspaper. The desperate glance seemed to have worked, because the old man staggered back, as if not hearing the pair come in. Mr. Wilson nearly opened his mouth to protest when Arthur cut him off mid-thought. "Oi, don't you bloody dare," Arthur murmured as he slipped a small razor knife and pressed it to the man's back, slightly out of sight of the innkeeper. "Is there a problem, Mr. Wilson? You look quite pale, sir," the bony old man said, straining his neck to see the figure behind the merchant. Arthur buried his head deeper into his cloak, urging the man to get on with it. "There's no problem, Mr. Collinsworth. No problem at all. I was just showing my guest here to my quarters for a late tea. Have a nice evening," Mr. Wilson said shakily, as he bowed a nod to the innkeeper. The old man made another attempt to see the hooded Arthur, but he soon gave up and returned to his paper the moment they were halfway up the stairs. Mr. Wilson crept forward slowly as he led Arthur through the corridor before stopping in front of the door numbered 213C. The sound of squeaking and clattering cutlery rounded the corner. Arthur turned his head to see a blonde lady walk around the corner pushing a cart. Her cheeks were flush red and warm in comparison to her nearly pale white skin. She looked young to Arthur, no older than her mid-20s. Her eyes were striking blue, complementing the rest of her figure. Their eyes met as she nearly rammed him with the cart.
"Oh dear me, I apologize. I almost hit you. I'm really sorry. I should really watch where I'm going,"
she exclaimed, as she moved quickly to hold a teapot that nearly fell. "It's no problem. We're probably in your way. We'll just be going," Arthur said, as he tugged at Mr. Wilson's arm, pulling him closer to the door. He waited for her to continue down the hallway, but noticed that the cart hadn't budged. Arthur turned back to the woman. Her piercing blue eyes looked eye level to Arthur.
"Is everything all right there, Walter?"
The lady smiled, not moving her gaze from his. Her rosy red lips parted slightly. "Everything is all right, Mary. I was just having a late tea with an old friend." Mr. Wilson smiled painfully. Arthur could tell the man's smile wasn't genuine, but he did not press the issue as Mary smiled and excused herself. She led the cart away from Arthur's prying eyes as she rounded the corner and disappeared from sight. Arthur turned back to the merchant as he watched him fumble for his keys. He manoeuvred one of the larger ones into the keyhole and turned the key to open the door to his room. Arthur crossed the threshold. It was a large room, definitely made for a man of his stature, as it was dressed in hand-sewn cloth and pillows. Arthur looked around, his eyes landing on rows upon rows of clothes and shoes. The merchant's coats hung neatly on racks, and his shoes were gently bunched together in boxes forming a neat little stack. His bed laid as if untouched, as the pillows and blankets were soft but firm at the head of the bed. Arthur ran his hand on the bedside. The room seemed to be split in half, with the only other doors being one leading to the bathroom, and the other being the one they'd just entered. Mr. Wilson threw off his coat with a huff, hanging it near the door. He lit a candle nearby, before shuffling his way to remove his shoes. Arthur proceeded to do the same, quickly removing his wand from his coat pocket before hanging the jacket up on the coat rack. He stuffed the wand up his sleeve as Mr. Wilson led himself into the small kitchen.
Would you like some tea, young man? Let us not pretend this conversation isn't due for some.
He pulled a kettle from a cupboard, filling it with water, then placing it on the stove. Arthur shook his head, but the merchant, as if ignoring him, proceeded to light a matchstick before lighting another candle and threw it on the stovetop. A harsh glow of red appeared before settling down to a warm blue flame, nearly matching the still downpour of snow outside the near window. Arthur peered out of it, hoping to see the cool light of the moon, but was disappointed. It was well past darkness.
Your grandfather was a good man,
The merchant spoke, breaking the silence and the chatter of boiling water. Arthur turned his head to look at the man.
and maybe even a better detective. Holmes was a damn near genius,
Mr. Wilson continued.
And how did you come to know my grandfather? He wasn't exactly a sociable person.
Arthur spat, finding the nearest chair to plop himself into.
I mean, who didn't? Sherlock Holmes and his assistant, Dr. John Watson.
Wilson started.
Partner. My great-uncle was his partner, not his assistant.
Arthur corrected coldly.
Yes, partner. So that Rosa girl really took up Augustus's proposal. Who knew?
Mr. Wilson chuckled. He dug his hand into a tiny pot on the counter, producing a small handful of greenish leaves. He sprinkled them into the now whistling pot before placing them on a tray. Mr. Wilson then rummaged through his cupboards, laying what seemed to Arthur to be a cup of sugar, biscuits, and a set of mugs. He headed towards where Arthur sat and placed the tray on the small side table. The merchant poured himself a cup before producing a shiny flask from his pocket and poured a large amount of what looked like green mud into the cup. Arthur raised an eyebrow as he watched the man take a sip without wincing. He placed the cup back on the tray that separated them.
So tell me, how do you know so much about me and my daughter? And why do you think it's a trap?
Mr. Wilson said, sitting forward, pushing a cup in his direction. Arthur sat up straight, his attention now intrigued again. He took a whiff of tea before bringing it to his lips.
Venite incantatum,
Arthur whispered before taking a sip.
Did you say something, lad?
The merchant asked, looking at him curiously. Arthur shook his head vigorously as he gently put down the cup.
I didn't guess. I deduced. I just put the clues together and came to a conclusion. Like, for instance, someone besides you has been in this room.
Arthur leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table, and brought his hands together as if in prayer. The merchant looked around quickly.
What do you mean? The only person who should be in here should be the maid,
he exclaimed.
But she wasn't,
Arthur said quietly, unmoved.
How can you tell?
He asked, turning back to him. Arthur pointed at the door.
Your keyhole has scratches on it, almost as if it's been forced open.
Arthur turned and pointed to the man's clothes rack and boxes of shoes.
Your boxes of shoes have been moved slightly. They're off by mere inches, but any fool can tell you're not properly stacked, as if they're in a rush. And lastly,
Arthur said, rising to his feet.
It's been opened. Recently too. Instead of a pile of snow on the windowsill, it's almost clean. It's been snowing heavily for the last few days. There should be a big pile of snow obscuring by your window. That's why the candles went out and why the bed is slightly wet. We need to move quickly. They're looking for it. Looks like they've lost it.
He began to pace back and forth, his fingers running through his golden hair in thought.
Lost what, boy?
The merchant asked, watching him, his cup sloshing in his hand slightly. Arthur hastily walked over and pulled the amulet from his jacket.
Where'd you get this?
He said, holding it up like a badge. The man flinched.
A man traded it a few days ago. It looked like an old heirloom or something, so I took it. I thought it could catch a good resale. The green gems were interlaced with gold. It looked so genuine,
he said.
Well, what the man sold you was a fake, because I owned the original one. And this is not it. It was my grandfather's. He gifted it to me before he died.
Mr. Wilson looked away before looking back at Arthur, concern in his eyes.
Then, what of my daughter? How could I trade it for her life? A group of them came into the shop one day and asked for the amulet. They had no gold but promised they would return it, so I kept the amulet at home for safekeeping. After that day, when I returned home, my daughter grew ill. After I took her to the hospital, I returned to the shop to see what I could sell. Her medical procedures had become expensive. They returned to say that they'd heard what happened to my daughter and that they had an antidote they wouldn't mind trading for the amulet. You have to understand, I was desperate.
The man said, tears welling in his eyes.
What did the men look like, and where did you stay before coming to Boston?
Asked Arthur quickly.
They had cloaks, and each time I met one, they looked different. And we're from London, obviously. I've only stayed in this hotel because the hospital she's at is not far from here. Mass General, I believe. We don't live far from here, though. We've only just moved.
The man said, shaking.
Snatchers,
Arthur muttered to himself. The man looked at him with a confused look. Arthur sighed.
Well, unfortunately for you, the man who you brought this from almost got you killed. It's a fake. And if the buyers found that out, there'd be no reason to keep you alive if they felt you were trying to cross them.
Arthur said, beginning to pace again.
But I'm not trying to cross nobody. I just want my daughter safe back home. What do we do?
Pleaded the man.
We don't do anything. I, on the other hand, have to figure out why these men are hunting us. And I think I'll start by questioning your daughter.
Arthur said, as he pulled on his coat and began to open the door.
Us?
The man asked, again confused. Arthur pulled his coat collar up to his ears.
Yes, us. You're not the only one being chased,
Arthur said, before closing the door behind him.